Hi there, folks. Welcome back to the 2026 Heavily Biased Top 10. I am Tom, and this is the Undefeated Edition. So, you are listening to the first podcast or watching the first show, or if you have read the script, reading the first version of the 2026 college football season Heavily Biased Top 10. Welcome back. We are now just a few short days away from the season, with games starting up the end of next week. I've been doing this show for a while. I've been doing the podcast for a while. It's been entertaining to do, and definitely happy to be back. In this episode, we're going to talk about some of the expectations and what you're likely to see on a week to week basis. I'll go into a little bit of depth about how we decide the rankings. We'll talk a little bit more about those and what they are week to week as we get to them. But for right now, I'll just give you a little bit of a background and primer on kind of how that works. Talk about the early season list and go through those kind of tier by tier. We'll do the top tier contenders in a watch list. And then before we get out each week, we will go through conference rankings. So this is season 2 of the YouTube show. This is season 3 of the podcast. This is at least season 10 of the writing. Might be more than that. I'm just not certain. I'll have to look it up at some point when I catch one of the older pieces. The setup is a little different this year. I've got a little bit better microphone than I had. I'm not on a headset and recording things anymore. Though I do use those from time to time, just kind of depending on the week and the situation. I got a fun little ring light camera, so if you're on the YouTube channel, you should be able to see me fairly well. Some things that I'm still working on for the show, working on a little bit of audio editing, especially if you're listening to it as a podcast, and then music integration, which is not something I have quite figured out yet, but we'll get there. So if you know any of those kinds of things and you got comments on how this could be better, well, fire away. Expectations. What are we going to see? In the early season, you're going to get this, the Undefeated Edition. You're going to get a nice early season start where everybody is the same record at 0-0. And then some weekly updates as we go along with some of the big games, how the non-conference slate plays out. This is where everybody plays the majority of their non-conference games, which is really impactful and has a big hit on how we look at games later in the season and how we look at conferences later in the season, which is a part of how we evaluate teams later in the season. So these first few weeks, while very challenging sometimes for teams that don't play big games, are also can be very impactful for the season as a whole. It also matters how you play in your conference and how your conference plays those out of conference games. Once we get into conference play, you'll get a little positioning primers, especially early in the season. Some teams kind of are jockeying for position. There are several big games that come up in individual conferences fairly early on. And it's going to kind of set the race and set the tone for how the conference is playing. If you're seeing some of these big names and they are playing from a game behind in their conference, as Texas did last year, for example, where they're kind of chasing throughout the majority of the season, and they wind up falling short of playing in the conference championship game and wind up missing out on the playoffs as a result. Week 9 and beyond. Week 9 is where I start actual rankings. I try to get weekly shows as time allows. Try to get those out on Sundays, generally after we have seen that week's games, with updated rankings and going through who I think are the top teams in college football. As the CFP rankings come out in week 10, you're going to get sometimes a discussion of those CFP rankings, mostly in the primers. Week 9 and beyond, I try and do 2 shows a week. One will be a writing, and the writing is going to be on what to expect that week. I generally try and record that as quickly as I can and put it out about Wednesday or Thursday. And then updated shows talking about the bigger games of the week, what I expect the rankings to be on Sundays. Late in the season, we start to get to merits discussions, because at that point we're looking at teams that have 9, 10, 11 games of their resume out in front of us. And not only are we talking about solidifying those top several teams, we are also talking about how they get there. How do other teams get there? Is there a break point for where some of them might fall out? Is there a break point for where some of them might move in? What do the last few games in the conference season matter? How would it impact a team that is sitting on the bubble for teams that they have beaten to win late season conference games, for teams that they have lost to lose late season conference games? And so that's the late season discussion, gets into a lot of merits. I often cover quite a lot of numbers and math in there. One of the advantages of taking this into not just a podcast form, but into a YouTube channel, has been to allow me to present slides that have those numbers on them. So that's what to expect for the season. So how do we decide rankings? For a long time, what you often see in rankings columns just tended to be a name and a record. And those wins matter. You can only play the teams that are on your schedule. But I argue, and have argued for years, that not all wins are created equal. Everybody right now, otherwise everybody right now is number one, because everybody has the same 0-0 record. And really, that's how you should look at things going in. But the reality is that half those teams are going to lose week one. And by the time that we hit week two, most of them are well out of the running. That leads us into part number two: strength of schedule. Did you beat a bunch of 3-9 teams? What is that 10-2 record really? What is that 9-3 record? Did you beat a bunch of teams that are 8, 9, 10 wins? What happens when you're looking at two teams that are 11-1, and you're trying to decide which of those teams gets a bye versus which one does not? Who plays that last home game? And that matters a lot in some of these playoffs. We've only seen a couple of home losses by teams that have played, so it really, really does have some impact what's going on. We discussed merit as well in this, where we're looking at similar records. In the last couple of years, we've seen some times where teams are going into that last little bit with some of them will have a record that is sitting in a spot like 60-84 with the 144 data points that their teams played have. While others are sitting, same record, and their opponent's record is 92-52. One of these has more merit, whether you like to see them from the same conference or not. Direct head-to-head competition. We saw this last year when we were talking about Notre Dame. Do they have merit to be in the playoffs? Well, of course they do. But there's 3 teams that are sitting there, and 2 of them have beat them. Doesn't matter that they're in week 1 and 2. That's still the right call. Conference title, or especially conference title game participation. This is going to become more of a question as we start to look down the road with playoff expansion again looming. We'll discuss playoff expansion more as we get into later weeks, but that seems like a thing that is going to happen as an inevitability rather than as a question. And conference title games, what do you do with them? What is the merit of playing in that extra game? How does that extra data point help you? Should it hurt you? How does all that play out? And then finally, conference strength. I did say that a lot of these games in the early season have impact, and they do, because down the line, what is it that you look at when you try and compare a couple of teams with similar merit, with similar strength of schedule, but in non-conference play? One of the conferences is 700 and the other is 250. And, what do you do with these? How do you judge them one against the other? Well, you look at their non-conference play. How did tier 1 of a conference do against tier 1 of another conference? How did tier 3 of a conference do against tier 1 of that conference? And if you have places where your middle 3 teams have beaten 2 out of the top 3, from somebody else, which happened, for example, uh, which which has happened several times when you're talking about like ACC, SEC, or Big. I think Big 12 lost a couple of major games to middling Big Ten teams. Um, how do you stack those conferences against each other? So that's how we'll decide kind of week to week as we get out towards the later part of the season. I don't do rankings until we've seen about 7 games. Early season rankings are tiered and they're by expectation. That said, I've gotten pretty good at this over the years of writing, over the years of doing the podcast. We've had 2 runs now of 12-team playoffs. That's 24 playoff spots. I've got 19 correct with my preseason picks. And so 19 correct spots out of 24 is pretty good. If we cheat and say that technically I'm predicting there's a G5 is going to come through every year, then that's 21. But a G5 is going to come through every year. I don't really count that as what I'm going for. Let's talk the top tier. These are your preseason blue bloods. These are typically teams that have a lot of returning talent. They've got stable coaching. They have some good portal classes. They've got a lot of money in their war chest. They've spent a lot of it. They've replaced pieces that they think they need. These are the ones that are expected to be at or near the tops of their conferences once we get to season's end. Sometimes you're going to see just one. Sometimes you're going to see multiple. But here we go. Top tier includes Ohio State. Ohio State is returning QB1, RB1, wide receiver 1. This is a team that's going to have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder. They went 12-0 through the regular season. They are one of the most dominant defensive teams. I've heard some reports, and I haven't gone through to substantiate them, but they're credible, to say that they really intentionally handcuffed their quarterback play last year. That they essentially said, you're just here to drive the car. You're not here to make decisions. You're not here to do anything else. Don't play with the radio. Keep your hands on the wheel. Run the plays that we call. Don't stay on the rails. And that works when you have the kind of defense and the kind of schedule and the kind of talent that Ohio State had. To finish 12-0 with rare moments of exception, felt like a foregone conclusion. To finish 0-2 felt like a complete letdown. So this is going to be a team that has a big chip on their shoulder for a lot of very, very talented players that are returning. Similar spot, Texas. These two will play each other early in the season. Strong finish by Texas. Has a lot of returning weapons. Has one of the top several returning quarterbacks. I trust Steve Sarkisian in that offense, especially in continuity, to do very, very well. Their defense has improved. They've spent well in the portal. They've acquired some new talent at places where they were losing people. I expect this to be a very good team, and I expect this to be a very, very good game early in the season. Georgia has an experienced quarterback. Their top 3 rushers return, which means RB1, RB2, and quarterback, which were their top 3. Continuity of staff there has been excellent. Kirby Smart has always been able to put together a solid defense and a solid team. He's learned well how to just replace those pieces year after year, and to make adjustments to the players that are there, to continue to run the schemes and systems that have been very successful. This team is quite often built as somebody who is able to just drag you into the mud and then fight you on their terms. And I expect no different out of them this year. Notre Dame. I say Notre Dame because I have to mention the Memorandum of Understanding. And I still think that this is one of the dumbest phrases that ever gets uttered in the offseason. And I will be happy the year that it finally stops. I will be thrilled to see the rest of the conferences shut the door when Notre Dame's athletic director shows up. They have a memorandum of understanding that is supposed to hold this year, that is if Notre Dame finishes inside the top 12, which with their schedule, I can't see that not happening. They finish inside the top 12, they're guaranteed a playoff spot, which is utter bullcrap. But there it is. Miami, this is an unstable conference in the ACC. They have a very preferable schedule. They have some improved tie-breaking procedure. Miami nearly backed their way out of the championship or of the playoff last year, which they wound up in the championship game after doing so. And they nearly backed their way out by not participating in their conference championship game. Not by choice, but by terrible tiebreaker. And so the ACC nearly lost itself any representation as a result. Because of that, the ACC has new tie-breaking procedures put in, and they're not going to wind up in the same situation. Miami benefits from that. I said favorable schedule. Yes, they've changed over some talent. You're going to a new starter, but you're going to a new starter with a load of great wide receivers, and a schedule that lets you find your feet. Texas Tech is a placeholder here. They were the big splash of the transfer window and the big spender of the Big 12, with some big questions because, they picked the villain of the offseason cycle, and reasonably so. Many teams were saying, all right, well, if this is what you're going to do, we're not going to schedule you, and have since kind of pulled back from some of the cases that they lost. And as a result, they're not in a situation where they're quite as much of a villain going into the season. But this is definitely going to be something that can galvanize a team if you have that kind of controversy around, and now everybody has painted them as the bad guy. They were a very talented team last year. They're a very talented team going into this year. And they were able to spend a lot of money to be able to reload some of that talent pool in what is otherwise not a terribly deep conference. Contenders. If things line up their way, these teams are going to have a loss or two. But they're still going to be in contention heading into December, which is championship week. And in a lot of cases, that's going to be spot secured. Think Oregon last year, where, spot secured. They've got nothing to play for really going into the last couple of weeks because it is already decided that Ohio State and Indiana are going to play in the conference championship game. But barring catastrophic collapse, Oregon was in no way, shape, or form going to be left out of the playoff. So there are definitely ways that this can happen for them where these are teams that get locked in by that last week of December. In the ACC, I don't see any of those teams existing. I don't think that conference is terribly strong, and you'll see that reflected in the conference rankings. In the Big 12, I think that's BYU. They have a large core that returned. A large portion of the offensive line returned. I think that they are a solid enough team and had some solid enough play going into the end of the season. They are definitely a team to watch as far as contending for the Big 12 title. In the Big 10, that's Oregon, USC, and returning national champion Indiana. Indiana lost a lot. This last season was one of the oldest teams by starters that we have seen in a championship game in a long time. A bunch of these guys, there's no discounting what they were able to do. But a lot of these guys transferred over when Cignetti went to Indiana from James Madison. And so we're with him for a long period of time. We're in that fifth-year senior window and, had an average age that was an average starter age that was above 21 instead of under 19. Instead of under 20. And that matters, when you're talking about people that are very experienced in college ball, have a lot of time played together, have a lot of practice time. Those reps matter. And replacing those players is going to be the challenge. What did you do in the interim between these guys that you brought over and what you've built is going to still kind of remains to be seen. They don't have as favorable of a schedule this year in their top end, and you've painted yourself at the target. Let's see what you got. In the SEC, Oklahoma, Venables has been very hot and cold, but when things line up for him well, he's another one of these with a great defensive mind. He's got a quarterback that looks healthy going into the season, and they're capable of winning the big game. LSU, probably the other biggest splash of the offseason, really spilling into the end of last season, was the move of Kiffin from an Ole Miss team that is going to the playoffs out to LSU. And, I've got my own opinions as to whether or not that was the right decision. But those are my opinions. And, we'll see what happens. They had a huge crop of transfers. I have yet to see where 40 transfers in year one has been wildly, wildly successful. We'll see. They've got a decent schedule. They've spent a lot of money. They've got a lot of hype. Let's see what happens. And then finally, Alabama, which again is one of these that they've got good talent. They returned a fairly large portion of their defense. They've got a few offensive line starters to replace. They've got a big wide receiver to replace. But if they can figure out running the football, which seems to have been a priority in their camp, they have a schedule that lines up relatively well for them. And while they do play a very tough path through the SEC, it is not the hardest possible path through the SEC. And you go win your games and you put yourself in the right spot. There's an easy place to see where they could be locked into a playoff spot going into December. Finally, the watch list. These teams need a few things to go their way. They are likely to be underdogs in more than a couple of games this year, which puts them in a spot where they're going to have to either win a game that they're not supposed to, or they're going to have to hold serve in basically all the games that they're supposed to. Or they've got some bad matchups in different places, or they're playing away in the wrong game, or both. Good talent, good coaching, but we'll kind of see if it all lands. In the ACC, that's Clemson, where I still think that that's a very solid team overall. They've been building ground up for the most part, and we're going to start to see really what the merits of that are. And then SMU, which again kind of goes back to the idea of which one did you decide to do? Did you build by transfer or did you build internally? In the Big 12, that's Utah. Again, the Big 12 doesn't feel terribly stable. This is a team that has contended fairly well over time, and we'll see what they do. In the Big 12. In the Big 10, that's Michigan and Penn State, two polar opposites. Here you have a young quarterback coming into their own with Michigan, where you're really trying to see what this kid's got, what Underwood can do. And a talented team that's a couple years removed from their biggest wins, and really kind of trying to find their way and find their footing. They've got some tough games. They've got a tough conference, but they've got an okay road through it. Penn State, kind of the opposite. Penn State is changing over to a new quarterback after having a particularly bad year last year, where a lot of things didn't go their way. And we'll have to see what that staff can do to kind of put them on the right foot. The talent is there. Is the drive there? In the SEC, these are two teams that are coming off of playing in the playoffs, and that is Texas A&M and Texas A&M and Ole Miss. And here's two teams that have showed themselves to be playoff worthy contenders and have really gotten the job done last year. The question again becomes, overachieving versus longevity. You know, it's not likely that you're going to see 9 of the same teams in the playoffs again, year after year after year. That's just not likely. It is likely that you're going to see 4 or 5 that repeat most years because of the way college football is structured and because of the way some of these teams are structured. But that will change over time. You'll have teams that cycle out. This is, if we had done this in the late 90s, you would have expected Nebraska to be on this list. Right now, you haven't seen them. They're not there. But this is an opportunity in that watch list for Texas A&M and Ole Miss to really kind of take a step forward and to show themselves to be year after year contenders. One last thing before we head out. Let's look at conference rankings. And I'm looking at this by expected playoff spots. So every week or two, we will adjust this and kind of talk about where these are. And this is how we rank them, is just how many spots do I expect this particular conference to land in the playoffs. Coming in top going into the season is SEC. I've got them at 3.5, saying that they're basically an even split to go 3 or 4. The Big Ten, I've got at 3.2. I think that they've got just a little bit underneath that threshold. I still think that 3 is more likely than anything else, but that 4 is a little bit more of a stretch. The Big 12, I think that we're looking at most likely 2, which is why I have them at 1.8. The ACC is at 1 or 2, which is where they are sitting at 1.5. Due to the MOU, I think that this independent spot for Notre Dame is almost solid. So I have them at 1 full spot going in. Last year, there were plenty of places where that dropped down, and that's where some of the number can move around in those top groups, is to see what we're doing with that independent space. And then the G5 gets a spot as well, tying for 5th place in our conference rankings. That is it for episode 1. So Undefeated Edition in the books. We will see you back probably for a primer prior to the games next week. I'll be traveling during that week, and so my first actual week of doing a post college football show is probably going to be the week of the first major set of games. So until then, you can follow us on YouTube. You can find this show wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also check the description for a link to the Facebook profile, which will have the text blocks of this, where I go into a little bit of detail that I might sometimes miss during recording. Great to have you back. We'll see you next week.